When Dr. Bairnsfather approached Repair the World about partnering to bring Dr. Jake Newsome, we were really excited and thrilled. It's so important for us to come together to learn in this capacity. And Repair the World in particular, we are a service organization where we're working to recruit volunteers across the community to show up in service and to get involved in meaningful community initiatives. But part of that work is really about contextual learning and making sure that when we show up for each other in service, we're doing it with the knowledge of the context that we're showing up in, and that includes our history. And there's a lot of overlapping histories that are super relevant to today's lecture that affect many people in the room, indirectly and directly. For many of us, we're holding overlapping identities that Dr. Newsome will be talking about today as we discuss the historic and consistently continuous challenges that the LGBTQIA plus community has faced and continue to. Of course, as a trans leader in this space, I'm very personally connected to this cause and feel really grateful for you to be here and share your academic and archival work with us and your perspective. So with that being said, I do want to give a couple of special shout outs. Thanks to Naeem Martinez White for helping us with our awesome mic and tech. Thank you to CJ, our awesome ASL interpreter. Shout out to EECM for hosting us in the building. All of the Repair the World staff and fellows, y'all are amazing. The Holocaust Center staff and volunteers. And with that, I'm proud to welcome Dr. Lauren Bairnsfather up to get us introduced to Dr. Jake. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to do a little snaps here.
It's so good to see all of you and everyone online. Thank you for attending this program. A little background on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is why we're all here now. It's actually tomorrow. It's the 27th of January, which is the day when Auschwitz was liberated. So we're really marking that anniversary, and International Holocaust Remembrance Day is a United Nations holiday that began in 2005. So many of you may come to Yom HaShoah in April or May, which is a specific holiday that remembers the 6 million Jewish victims of the Nazis. International Holocaust Remembrance Day is a day when we remember all of the victims of the Nazis. So it's a really good time to shed light on lesser known histories from the Holocaust. So when I heard about this book, Pink Triangle Legacies, I thought, I can think of nothing better than this book on this day. So with great enthusiasm, we have Dr. Jake Newsome here with us. So before I introduce him, I'll echo the thanks that Jules has offered for the incredible Repair the World team, who really did a heavy lift to make this event happen. The Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh staff, always excellent, especially Christina Sahobi, who's not here. Tomorrow is her birthday. So if you see her, wish her a happy birthday. We have a board member at the Holocaust Center named Steve Zupchich, who has a real passion for this history. And he's watching online. He's not in town right now, but he's so committed to correcting the historical record. And I've had numerous conversations with him about what we can do to tell this particular Holocaust history, which as this book does, we're really making a correction to how we have understood this history for a very long time. And that's why it makes me so happy. And one other thing we love to do at the Holocaust Center is dig deeper into things that we thought we knew about. So I love that. And I love when historians really, are telling us here's something you didn't know. So I'll tell you about our guest, Dr. Jake Newsome. He is an award-winning scholar of German and American LGBTQ plus history, whose research and resources educate global audiences. His reach is around the globe. His work as a public historian is dedicated to making high-quality scholarship accessible, engaging, and relevant to diverse audiences beyond the classroom. So I'm just going to interject a little bit in my prepared remarks. When you read this book, and I saw many of you picked up the book, which is great, it is so engaging. I really felt like it was a hug. Yeah, the book is a hug. It's so welcoming. And I am also trained as a historian. I thought, what historian writes like this? So we had a whole conversation about it last night. So back to what I want to tell you about our guest. By shining light on the LGBTQ past, Newsome seeks to guide learners through a study of history to develop an ethical sense of compassion and wrestle with the ideals and challenges of responsible citizenship. His new book, Pink Triangle Legacies, coming out in the shadow of the Holocaust, traces the transformation of the Pink Triangle from a Nazi concentration camp badge into a global symbol of pride. The Lambda Literary Foundation named it as one of its most anticipated new LGBTQIA+ books of 2022. Since earning his PhD in history, Newsome has published in academic journals as well as popular outlets like the Washington Post, and has appeared as a guest on podcasts, including Getting Curious with Jonathan Van Ness. That is available. Listen to it. In addition to serving as a historical advisor for film projects, exhibits, and plays, Newsome has been invited by the French, UK, and US governments to speak about the important lessons that LGBTQ+ history has for all of us today. He now works as a museum professional in Washington, D.C., and for that reason, the feedback I got on our exhibit, which just opened at Chatham University, really has me floating about a foot above the ground. So before I bring Dr. Newsome up here, I want to encourage all of you to come and see our exhibit. We have public hours at noon, 1, and 2 o'clock, Monday through Friday, and you can book your free tickets online. And then we know you're coming and we can greet you and give you the kind of experience that we want you to have. And it's research like we're going to hear about tonight that allows us to really push what we're putting on our walls and have a deeper kind of conversation than we've had before on this very relevant and timely topic. So please.
Wow, I wish that we could put that on the book cover, that this book is a hug. Because sometimes after reading parts of it, you might need a hug. But I just hope as you're reading it, you feel me hugging you through the pages. Because sometimes, I mean, I love giving good hugs, so I love that. Well, thank you first of all to Lauren for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for braving the weather to come out and join us this evening. I'm originally from Georgia, so I might as well be in Antarctica. But I am glad that you all here are hardy stock and joined us this evening. Before we jump into the content, I just want to thank again Lauren and the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh for the invitation and their support to come be here this evening. Thanks also to Christina and Jackie at the Holocaust Center for doing all the logistics and helping to put this together. I've had the pleasure of spending much of the day with Cindy at the Holocaust Center as well, and got to visit their new public exhibit that just opened up, as I understand, last week. And it's really, really incredible. I think it's a courageous and accessible way of telling Holocaust history. So if you get a chance, I encourage you to please go and visit it. Thanks also to Repair the World and the University of Pittsburgh's Jewish Studies Department for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I love the idea of history bringing organizations and bringing people together. And so I really appreciate the coalition of support for this talk. I also spent some time reading about the work of the space that we're in here, the East End Cooperative Ministries, and it just really is an honor to be here in this space. So I am just really, truly, deeply grateful to have been invited by institutions and organizations whose mission I support so wholeheartedly, and I'm thankful, really thankful to be here with all of you and share this space tonight. So as Lauren said, we're here to mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is a chance for us to honor the 6 million Jews that were targeted and murdered by not just the Nazis, but also their supporters. But it's also a chance for us to take a step back, think about and reflect on the other groups that were targeted by the Nazis, but who have for a very long time been excluded from the history books, excluded from commemoration ceremonies and acknowledgement of their suffering. And one of those groups is the folks that we would today recognize as the LGBTQ community. So as a college student, which when I stopped to do the math, I'm always surprised by how long ago that actually was. I took every single course on the Holocaust, on Nazi Germany, on World War II that my university had to offer. By the end of my 4 years as a student, I assumed, as young people often do, that I knew everything that there was to know about the Holocaust. But it wasn't until the very last semester at university that a guest speaker came and gave a lecture on Hitler's pink triangle prisoners. Right? This was referring to the gay prisoners in the concentration camps who were marked by the pink triangle. And it suddenly occurred to me that over the course of 4 years, I had not studied anything about this particular group. Of course, there was always kind of a bullet point list of homosexuals were persecuted, but then that was it. I also found myself frustrated at myself for not having asked over the course of those years more about this particular group, because this was also the time in my life when I was coming out, trying to figure out what it meant to live, be a gay person, connect with, understand gay history. And so it was after, again, studying this history for 4 years that for the very first time, I thought, what happened to people like me? And so when I started asking professors what happened to the LGBTQ community and how come I didn't know about it, I was told, well, after the Holocaust, homosexuality remained such a taboo that no one talked about it. Not the survivors, not the Allies, not the Germans. And so how can you write a history with no evidence? And so at the time, that seemed to make sense to me, right? That like you can't write a history if you don't have anything to write about or archival material to study. So then again, as a young naive person, I go on to graduate school and say, okay, I'm going to be the very first one in all of history to research this topic and write this book and finally break the silence. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go to the archives in Germany and find nothing, right? Because that's what I had been told. So imagine my surprise when I get to the archives in Germany and find instead mountains and mountains of material on the topic, letters and diaries and court records, police criminal documents, compensation applications, right? So I suddenly had to readjust my research questions to say, okay, well, at first I thought no one talked about it. Clearly that's wrong. Everyone talked about it. Why then was that? And there was even a handful beginning in the 70s of some scholars in Germany, most of them queer themselves, who had started to publish, histories about this topic. And I thought, well, if that's the case, if people have known about this since the Holocaust, how could I study it in 2006, 2009, and not learn about it? How was it not integrated into more mainstream Holocaust education? And so suddenly the research project that I started, I wanted to look at queer people in Germany between 1933 and 1945, became a study that went on for decades and was on different continents, because the question changed to how did we forget about this chapter of history? And what were the implications of forgetting the suffering of an entire group of people? So to tell this history, which I said traces, which spans continents and decades, I decided to use a symbol that is at the heart of everything, which is the pink triangle. So tonight, before I can speak about the pink triangle's legacies, I want to talk about the pink triangle's origins. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And I tell you, I'm staying here because I know this is where the camera is so that I can be, so folks online can see me, but I'm really fighting the urge to go into lecture mode and like walk up and down the aisles, but we'll keep it planted here. And by the early 1930s in Germany, there was a small right-wing fringe party called the Nazi Party that was slowly gaining considerable followership in the country. And in 1932, they became the largest party in the country. January of 1933, this party's leader, Adolf Hitler, was appointed Chancellor of Germany. And this new Nazi government wanted to create a so-called racially pure society. And it labeled several groups as clearly not belonging to this new German society. So some groups, like Jewish people, the Roma, people with disabilities, the Nazis believed posed a deep biological threat to this new national community. Because you see, they didn't just look at Jews and see someone with a different culture or different religion, but they believed they were a different and subhuman race. So because the threat was biological, the Nazis' policies towards these groups evolved from removing them from German society, from German land, and then under the cover of war, ultimately from life itself. But there were other groups that the Nazis labeled as enemies of the state, like political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the LGBTQ community, amongst others, that the Nazis did find problematic. They did find them to be a threat, but they believed that their beliefs or their actions could force them to change, and then they would be reintegrated back into, productive members of German society. So the Nazis were obsessed with understanding and then controlling human sexuality. In fact, this was the key to literally reproducing the master race. At this time, and this was a view that is not unique to the Nazis, German leadership did not believe that people were born LGBTQ. They believed that folks were essentially engaging in what they called the homosexual lifestyle. They believed it was a vice that folks chose to partake in. And because it was a vice, there was a temptation, they believed it was dangerous because then anyone could be tempted into that lifestyle. And so they believed that it was a very real threat. So because the Nazis believed that being well, I guess not being LGBT, but engaging in that lifestyle was a vice, their policies for this community remained, at least officially, to cure and re-educate them. The Nazis never planned to mass murder or exterminate all LGBTQ people in their regime, simply because they didn't believe that LGBTQ people existed as someone different than a straight person. So they did make it quite clear, though, there would be no room for the homosexual lifestyle in their new Germany. And so they spent all of their efforts trying to eradicate all expressions of LGBTQ life. Next slide, please. One of the very first things that the Nazis did when coming to power was try to control access to information. So they banned all LGBTQ publications. You might be familiar with the famous Nazi book burnings in Berlin in May of 1933, but what you might not know is that the vast majority of those books that were burned that evening, and the most famous of the book burnings, were taken from an organization called the Institute for Sexual Science, which was a world-renowned leader in understanding LGBTQ life, history, and culture. Over 20,000 rare books, journals, and artifacts were destroyed in the Nazi book burnings in Berlin in May of 1933. The Nazis also wasted no time in shutting down bars, clubs, political organizations of the LGBTQ community, starting first in Berlin, but then expanding in waves throughout the country. Slide, please. They targeted anyone whose gender or sexuality did not conform to their strict ideals, but the Nazis viewed queer men as the most dangerous of the LGBTQ community. And that's because in Germany, like most other countries at the time, it was men who held positions of authority, whether it was in the economy or national politics or in the military. So they believed that any type of deviancy of this man could pose a direct threat to the everyday running of the Nazi government. So most of their policies were focused on confronting queer men, but of course that doesn't mean that queer women were not persecuted. It just means that the Nazis weren't looking quite as hard for them. So paragraph 175, which you can see the text of here on the screen, was a law on the German criminal code that the Nazis actually inherited. It had existed in Germany since the unification of the country in 1871, and it explicitly forbade and criminalized same-sex activity between men. And you would think, okay, when the Nazis come to power, they inherit this national anti-gay law, that they would be thankful for that, I guess. But they found that the original wording of the law was too constricting. So in 1935, which is the same months that they are passing the famous Nuremberg race laws, they also amend paragraph 175, and you can see the new version here on the screen. And they talk about a man who commits indecency with another man. How in the world do you define that? And that's exactly the point, right? They wanted it to be purposely vague so that prosecutors and judges can interpret that however they wanted in the effort of arresting and prosecuting as many queer men as possible. So one of the things that I have been most shaken by in my research, and if we could go to the next slide, please, is the ways in which the Nazis' anti-LGBTQ policies were wildly popular with the German population. So much so that the most Germans agreed with the Nazis' war against the LGBTQ community, and records show that they used their voices in record numbers to activate the violence of the regime against queer people in staggering numbers. And in fact, we know that out of all the paragraph 175 cases that resulted in a conviction against a queer man, 1/3 of them were the result of civilian denunciations. So these were neighbors, co-workers, landlords turning these queer men in. We also know that even though paragraph 175 did not specifically target transgender people or lesbians, ordinary German people still denounced them in staggering numbers to the Gestapo and to the Nazi police officials, to the point where Nazi police officials they actually run articles in the papers saying paragraph 175 only applies to men, and please stop overburdening us. We need to catch up on this backlog of cases. So ordinary people essentially are thinking that the Nazis are not going far enough, and they are turning in lesbians and transgender people to the Nazi regime, even though it wasn't explicitly stated under the law. In total, we can go to the next slide, please. In total, about 100,000 queer men were arrested, and over half of them were convicted. You can see that the staggering number rises after the 1935 amendment of the law. And in fact, it rises by 740% after the amendment of the law. We don't yet have accurate statistics on the number of queer women who were arrested because they were arrested under different laws or just taken into custody by the Gestapo, and they didn't even need to be breaking a law. And so researchers out there are still compiling accurate statistics to be able to give us a comparative understanding of what happened to queer women. Now, next slide, please. When prisoners were sent to camps, they were labeled with a color-coded triangle badge on their uniform to mark their so-called crime. So if you could click, please. The men who were sent to the concentration camps for being queer were marked with a pink triangle. Slide. We know that lesbians and transgender people were also sent to camps, and they did not have their own separate category. They were marked with a black triangle, which was an umbrella category for so-called asocials or social deviants. This was a category that also included sex workers, people experiencing homelessness, a wide range of people that the Nazis felt somehow did not fit into their social, into their society, were marked with the black triangle. Next slide. Pink triangle prisoners were subjected to harder work details in the concentration camps because hard work was deemed more masculine. And the idea was that by engaging in good old man's work, they would somehow be reoriented back to being straight. Gay men were also subjected to incredibly invasive, humiliating, and violent medical experimentation as a way to try to find a biological cure for this so-called disease. I want to say, I mentioned earlier that the Nazis' official policy for the queer community was curing them. But in the concentration camp universe, out of those men who wore the pink triangle, 2/3 of them died in the concentration camps. That's an incredibly high mortality rate, especially when you count, amongst those groups who were not slated for mass extermination. Slide, please. After the Allies defeated Germany in May of 1945, they were left with the task of caring for the hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors. Led by the Americans, the Allies adopted a policy that they would release the prisoners who had been incarcerated because of their race, religion, or political stance. But they said it was too dangerous to release so-called common criminals back into the general population. And because the men with the pink triangle had broken paragraph 175, a national law, the Allies considered them to be common criminals. So for any concentration camp survivor who was marked with the pink triangle, if they had time left on their prison sentence, which again was given to them by Nazis, let's just remind ourselves of that, the Allies would take them from the liberated concentration camp to a nearby prison where they were forced to serve the rest of their term. And we know that sometimes that was up to 2 to 3 years that these men would have to wait for liberation. So the Allies at this point also tried to purge all of the Nazis' laws from the German criminal code. And they decided to leave it up to the Germans of what to do with paragraph 175. When Communist East and Democratic West Germany were created in 1949, both of those countries decided to keep the explicitly Nazi version of paragraph 175. The next slide, please. Pierre Ciel, who was a Frenchman who was put into a concentration camp during the German occupation, said powerfully at the end of the war that liberation was only for others. So beginning immediately after the creation of West Germany, gay people challenged paragraph 175 in court. And we can go to the next slide, please. They said that it went against the new democratic constitution to continue using the Nazi version of an already discriminatory law. But West German courts continuously rebuked any claims that fascism lived on in the law. Next slide. In 1957, the West German Constitutional Court ruled once and for all that the country would keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. And it turns out they didn't just keep it, they used it extensively. So if you remember that graph that we saw just a few slides ago of the number of paragraph 175 convictions, if you expand it to the next slide, please, to include the entire existence of that law, this is what it looks like. In the first 20 years of its existence, West Germany used the Nazi version of paragraph 175 to arrest a staggering 100,000 queer men. In 1963, a historian and theologian, Hans Joachim Schoep, said that for homosexuals, the Third Reich hasn't ended yet. Next slide. Now, debates around the legality or constitutionality of paragraph 175 are not the only places where Germans discussed the Nazis' queer victims. It also came up in discussions around compensation. So on the screen, you can see a letter from a German man named Bruno Bouchard, writing to a post-war compensation board looking to be recognized as officially as a victim of the Nazi regime. He had spent 4 years in prison under paragraph 175. He survived the war and then again wrote to be officially recognized as a Nazi victim. Unfortunately, the compensation board denied his claim, but Bruno did something pretty rare. He appealed. And he appealed again and again and again, leaving a really rare paper trail for historians like myself to be able to find his case in the archives and piece together this efforts of very intentional silencing on his part. So what you're seeing here is one of those appeals, and you can tell that he's underlined a part on the document. And so I've translated that for you. So if you could please click next. Yep. You can see that he states, and again, he's trying to tell them, why he should be recognized as a victim of the Nazis. If my actions do not seem political enough to you, I would just like to point out my castration, which was demanded of me in the detention center, although I was never convicted by a proper court because I had instead been taken to a camp. Such a brutal intrusion on a healthy human body was only possible in Nazi Germany and should be enough to convince you that I was a victim of fascism. Unfortunately, the compensation board was not convinced. They rejected Bruno's application again, but they didn't stop there. If you remember, paragraph 175 is still in effect, and essentially Bruno had just admitted to actions that were still illegal. So this compensation board notified the local police office, and the police come to arrest Bruno Bouchard. According to the records, Bruno somehow is not arrested by these police. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but he's not arrested. But unfortunately, the historical record goes cold after that, and we don't know what happened to Bruno Bouchard after that. So if we could click again, please. What I would like to do is show you now a short 3-minute clip of a gay concentration camp survivor named, he goes on record only as Heinz F. And he's in this clip from a documentary called Paragraph 175. He talks about his experience after the Holocaust. So if you could just, I think you can actually just click the next button and it should start playing from YouTube.
Wie lange sind Sie in Konzentrationslagern gewesen?
Zusammen. Ich habe mal zusammengerechnet, ich glaube 1 Jahr.
Was haben Sie gemacht, als Sie zurückkamen?
Ja, wieder nach Hause kam.
Ja.
Ja, da bin ich ins Geschäft, elterliche Geschäfte gegangen, das mein Bruder führte. Mein Vater war ja gestorben.
Haben Sie Ihrem Bruder oder Ihrer Mutter erzählt, was passiert ist in den Lagern?
Ich habe mit meiner Mutter nie drüber gesprochen. Mit meinem Vater konnte ich darüber sprechen, aber...
Warum nicht?
Aus Scham. Meine Mutter hat doch nie was gesagt. Das ist alles geduldig ertragen.
Aus Scham, worüber?
Meine Mutter, meinte, die aus Scham geschult. Oder aus überquellendem Mitgefühl vielleicht, um mich auch nicht zu beleidigen oder es mir noch schwerer zu machen. Nicht ein Wort hat die...
Für heute ist es ganz schwer vorzustellen, dass Sie diese schrecklichen Jahre überlebt haben und zurückkamen und
mit keinem drüber sprechen konnten, ja. Hab nie mit jemandem drüber gesprochen.
hätten Sie gern mit jemandem darüber gesprochen?
Vielleicht mit meinem.
Haben Sie später mit anderen darüber sprechen können?
Nie. Es wollte auch keiner hören, wenn man bloß irgendein Stichwort sagt. Also, lass mich mit dem Kram zufrieden. Ich bin nur vorbei und damit ist erledigt.
I actually think I can bring this up to you so you can do if that works. Yeah. Okay. Naeem, can you just turn down 2? We're going to do a quick tech upgrade. Okay. Long cords are great. So, oops. Let's see. Few arrows, or let me pull this over. There we go. Oh, it's done. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Move this out of there, and we're good. Thank you.
So of course, Heinz's story is incredibly heartbreaking, but I think one of the things that makes it more so is knowing that his is just one of thousands. So a lot of times, whether it was my professors talking to me in educational programs and books, LGBTQ folks are often talked about as one of the Nazis' so-called forgotten victim groups. But here what we've seen, okay, now I'm hearing myself. Should I just mute this one? Perfect. There we go. Thanks for bearing with us. We want to make sure that everyone online can see and hear and learn along with us as well. But what we can see in these 2 studies is that no one had forgotten what happened to the Nazis' queer victims. And in fact, Germans knew what happened to them, and a lot of them agreed with what the Nazis did. And in fact, they continued to discriminate and persecute this particular group. Some men like Bruno, who we saw, decided to break their silence and tell their story, but those with more authority and positions of power essentially told them to be quiet because he was in fact not a real victim, he was a criminal. The stifling environment of homophobia forced many men like Heinz to keep his memories hidden, even from his family, never to speak of them again. So writing this book has taught me a lot about the nature of silence. When I first started writing it, I thought about silence as a noun, right? The absence of sound, the absence of memories, the absence of knowledge. But what we are seeing here is silence as a verb, right? To silence, to keep someone from talking. West German politicians, judges, historians, journalists, and even members of the public had silenced the Nazis' LGBTQ victims for decades. But by the 1970s, gay activists were about to break that silence once and for all. So in the summer of 1969, the West German parliament finally amended paragraph 175. And it was not because they were pro-gay rights by any means. It was because actually too many people had been accusing the West German government of not having learned the lesson from their Nazi past. So this new version of paragraph 175 it legalized being gay amongst men essentially over the age of 21. It was still a discriminatory law because it was a higher age of consent than that set for straight people. But either way, this paved the way for the emergence of a political gay rights movement. And activists in this new movement sought to mobilize queer people into action across the country. Now, at this time, the act of coming out, of publicly claiming a gay identity, was not just a personal decision. It was seen as a political tactic. right? So by revealing how many people were actually LGBTQ, activists sought to establish this community as a political minority to be taken seriously. So now West German activists in the early 1970s suggested that they could out themselves to the public by wearing a gay symbol, which that raised a really big question. What is a gay symbol? How do you market oneself as gay? Now, in 1972, a small publisher in Hamburg released a short book that would ultimately have a monumental impact across the world. Written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, it was the first book by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their story. The title, which translates to The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to the problem of visibility. Activists knew that West Germans would instantly recognize the pink triangle as a concentration camp symbol and thus be faced with the fact that their recent history wasn't completely in the past. In March of 1972, a leftist group in Frankfurt called Rot Schwul became the very first organization in the world to use the pink triangle as a symbol of gay rights activism. Now, the Gay Action Group of West Berlin was the nation's largest and ultimately one of the most influential gay groups, soon adopted the logo as well. And in many documents, they wrote about how they knew that this was not just a political tool, that this reclaiming of the pink triangle represented a fundamental transformation of a symbol and an identity. Now, the original pink triangle had labeled being queer as something that was criminal and worth punishing, but they reclaimed it and said that being queer is in no way shameful. They robbed the pink triangle of its negative power by saying that being gay is not an insult, and in fact, we're going to wear this as a badge of pride. Now, during my research, I was able to meet Peter Heidenstrom, who was one of the founding members of that organization. And he explained to me that the use of the pink triangle signaled an individual's choice to come out, but it also, on a kind of larger sense, represented a coming out of this particular chapter of Holocaust history that had been hidden for decades. So this new display of the pink triangle signaled also a new phase of queer activism. Past activists had argued for the right to privacy. Essentially, they argued that the government should not persecute LGBT people as long as they stayed in the privacy of the metaphorical closet. But beginning in the 1970s, the pink triangle sought to tear the closet doors off its hinges. In wearing the pink triangles on pins or plastering it on park benches or on train stations, on flyers all over the country, West German gay activists asserted that a citizen living in a democratic society had the fundamental right to express their sexuality freely and openly. So the reclamation of the pink triangle originated in West Germany, but it did not stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activist Alliance in New York City planned a rally in the support of a gay rights bill that was being debated there in the city council. Led by David Thorstad and John Larson, the GAA designed and wore these buttons that you see here on the screen. It was the very first documented instance of the pink triangle's use in political activism in the United States. From there, it spread across the country. Queer activists used the pink triangle and the history that it represented to call out homophobia and to promote equality. They did so from New York down to Miami, over in San Francisco, and everywhere in between. And in America too, gay activists understood their use of the pink triangle as transformative, right? Of transforming something negative into something powerfully positive. Jewish and lesbian activist Martha Shelley told me that the pink triangle also had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. Now, by the early 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widely used symbol in modern LGBTQ activism in North America and across Europe. It resonated with communities from multiple ethnicities and backgrounds, as well as various gender identities and sexual orientations. In 1986, a group of activist artists in New York City catapulted the pink triangle into the public consciousness in a new way when they designed the now iconic Silence Equals Death poster, which was meant to motivate people to take action during the AIDS crisis. A few months later, when the AIDS activist group ACT UP adopted the poster, the pink triangle became a visible symbol of AIDS activism, not just in the United States, but across the world. But the pink triangle has never been just about politics. Transgender activist Nancy Nangeroni used symbolism as a means of bridge building. As she told me, back in the 1990s, there was homophobia in the trans community and transphobia in the gay community. So she tried to build solidarity amongst those two communities by combining symbolism of the communities. You can see here by combining a transgender symbol on top of the pink triangle. Intersectionality also prompted Jose Gutierrez to form Triángulo Rosa, which was a gay support group for Latina gay men and lesbians in Washington, D.C. Now, Jose has since become a really dear friend since I wrote this book, and he speaks just so beautifully and passionately about what the pink triangle continues to mean to him today, even though he, as a Mexican American, has no direct connection to its history or originating in Germany. He said he felt that connected to the pink triangle because it had come to represent a gay community, in fact, a gay identity that transcended national borders and shared a history. This history was vitally important with Black and queer author Cheryl Head. In the early 1980s, she traveled to Israel for work on an assignment, and while there, she visited Yad Vashem, which is Israel's National Holocaust Memorial, and she stood in shock as she read about that triangle badge document, where she learned that also there was a pink triangle for homosexual concentration camp inmates. She said later she saw the pink triangle again in the United States on one of the Silence Equals Death posters, but confided in me that the poster would not have been as meaningful to her if she had not already learned the history of that symbol while she was at Yad Vashem. Unfortunately, even at the time that Cheryl would have seen that poster, that history behind the symbol was still largely unwritten. Professional historians and museums, academic journals, all refused to study or provide space for the topic. And as late as 1996, a state archive in Hamburg got caught destroying case files on the Nazis' gay victims in order to make room for what they called more archive-worthy material. You can see a newspaper clipping about that here. Since the 1970s, a handful of grassroots scholars risked their reputations and their livelihoods to research this history when no one else would. In those early years, there was very little distinction between a grassroots researcher and an activist, because it was the same person who was marching in the streets as they were rummaging around in the archives. So again, this is just another example of when the historical profession shut out the LGBTQ community, queer folks set out to write the history themselves. So to this day, it's still a very small group of us who are researching and writing and preserving this history, and my book would not be possible without the work of the people that you see on the screen, as well as many others. As we come to a close, in 2002, the German government finally recognized the men persecuted under paragraph 175 as official victims of the Nazi regime. This meant that they were also eligible for compensation finally, but this again is in 2002. The youngest survivors would have been at least in their mid-80s, and they had been told their entire lives that their suffering was not actually suffering. It was an injustice. It was the legal system running its course. So no gay survivors came forward to claim compensation. So to this day, not a single gay survivor has received a penny of official compensation from the German government. Up to now, the memorials and the debates about compensation have revolved around very specifically paragraph 175 and the so-called pink triangle prisoners. And what does that mean? It means that the conversations revolve around the experiences of queer men and queer men only. This has led to several outcomes. Queer women were not and still are not eligible for compensation. And it was only in, well, last year, and technically now 2022, that a permanent memorial to the Nazis' lesbian victims was for the first time established at the Ravensbrück concentration camp. That was in April of 2022. So this is still a history and a topic that is being discussed. Now today, if you asked anyone what the symbol of the LGBTQ community is, probably no one would say the pink triangle, right? We would all say the rainbow flag. And in many ways, the rainbow flag, when it was created, is actually the antithesis of the pink triangle. In 1978, Harvey Milk and a San Francisco artist and activist named Gilbert Baker decided they wanted something new, a new symbol for the gay community to be displayed in San Francisco's Gay Pride March that year for the very first time. And what Baker created, well, actually Baker said that right now we only have the pink triangle, which comes from the Holocaust and from Hitler. We need something with soul, something uplifting, something happy. So what they created was the very first rainbow flag. And as we've seen, the rainbow flag has achieved a level of visibility that the pink triangle never did beyond the queer community. But I would argue that in order for it to become so widespread, it has been tamed. It is made more palatable by becoming less radical. In a lot of ways, this gay pride symbol has been turned into a PR tool and a marketing tactic. Each June, corporations turn their logos into rainbows. They make a lot of money. But where are those same corporations when state governments begin to dismantle LGBTQ rights? July comes around and the rainbows disappear. Now, despite all of the cliches, there's not always a rainbow at the end of every storm. The LGBTQ people were among the communities that the Nazis targeted first because the Nazis knew that doing so would help them win votes by unifying segments of the conservative right who might not agree on the rest of the Nazis' policies. We are seeing very similar tactics being used by the extreme right wing today. It is not a coincidence that we are seeing a resurgence of white supremacy, extreme nationalism, book banning, and the worst year on record for anti-LGBTQ legislation. In today's era of the Republicans don't say gay bills, we need the pink triangle more than ever. If we are to truly honor those who originally wore the pink triangle, whether those who had no choice to wear it in the concentration camps or those who first reclaimed it in the 1970s, we have to commit to action on a daily basis. The LGBTQ community has every right to exist, and not just quietly in the closet, right? But also in history books, in curriculum, in movies, and TV shows. In every single way that we talk about the world, we have the right to exist. And we need to fight like hell to defend that right, because the pink triangle reminds us of what happens if we don't. Thank you very much. So I will be happy to take some questions. I think we've got time, right?
For folks who are here in person, you would like to walk up to the mic, say your question, or we'll repeat it on the mic.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I can repeat questions if that's okay. That'll make it a little easier. Okay. Yeah, Sharon? Yeah, I'll repeat it. Mhm.
People were in it, and I think that building was and I know that travels around. I didn't know what it was ever on Broadway, and just put it on and I think that it has been revived. And when that was out there, I remember in the 70s, even in the US, there were things going on with that.
Mhm.
I don't know if a lot of Holocaust commemorations or exhibitions or archives want to keep engaged that way. I mean, it's still coming out of
Yeah, so there's actually, so the question was about a play called Bent. It was written and directed by a guy named Martin Sherman. It premiered first in London and then on Broadway a year afterwards in 1979, 1978 in England and then 79 in the United States. And it has continued to be performed and produced on stages large and small, really across the world. It's been nominated, I think, for a Tony. It was turned into a Hollywood movie with Clive Owen. Ian McKellen was in the original production of it. And it tells the story of two gay Germans in the early 1930s who were sent to a concentration camp for being gay. It is an incredibly groundbreaking, pioneering piece of art and piece of history. There was not a single published piece of scholarship on the topic available in English at the time. So the fact that Martin Sherman was able to do enough research to go find and identify and talk to the activist scholars who were beginning to uncover this history enough to be able to put together a script for an entire play that still to this day holds up to, historical standards. It's quite accurate. Is really just groundbreaking. But it also, again, is another, and I write a lot about it in the book. So if you want to read more about Bent, it's in chapter 5, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But the fact that no one else is talking about it, so the queer community says, okay, well, if we can't put it in museums and we can't write about it in journals or put it in the newspaper, we'll put it on the stage, right? And in Germany, this is where it gets really interesting. In Germany, this is a time where the earliest scholars of this topic, again, who are almost entirely gay or queer themselves, use the German productions as a chance to share their scholarship. So in my research, so this is in the early 1980s, in Germany, when it goes, it's run under the title Pink Triangle, actually, instead of Bent. And you might see in the playbill just one sheet of paper that says who the director and the actors are, and the rest of the playbill is scholarly historical articles written by, so finally they said, okay, well, if we can't find any other outlet to publish our work, we will inform these people, not just entertain them, right? And so Bent is this watershed moment where most people who are introduced to this topic were introduced through the stage play. Thank you for that. Yes, please just read it to me. Who knows what I'll be reading over here? Perfect. So again, just to repeat it, the question is about the status of lesbians and gay men in both the Weimar Republic and East Germany. So that's a really, I can recommend 2 really great books on the topic, because there's a lot to be said about this question. The first is the Weimar Republic, which was Germany's democratic form of government right before the Nazis came to power. After Germany lost World War I, a democracy was established, and the LGBTQ community, especially in Berlin, established an unprecedented, vibrant and dynamic queer culture for themselves in Berlin. And in fact, Berlin kind of became an unofficial gay capital of the world. Folks flocked there from New York and Paris and London to experience this level. I'm not going to call it full acceptance, but at least an unprecedented level of tolerance. And so lesbian communities had their own newspapers and publications, and nightclubs and bars, but also cafes and political organizations, the same way that gay men and transgender individuals had as well. I often find myself wondering, did the queer community in Berlin in, let's say, 1928 ever imagine what was coming just a few years later? And I think they probably didn't. And to me, there's this, on the one hand, you see this unprecedented LGBTQ community. The Nazis really were able to destroy that sense of, or that community in Berlin with a matter, not even a month, within a matter of weeks. We're able to drive it back, at least underground. It was not publicly visible anymore. And to me, that is an important reminder that progress is always fragile. Just because a community wins visibility or acceptance or even political rights, it doesn't mean that that can't be taken away instantly. And so to me, that is Weimar's lesson, is that we can't become complacent with what we might enjoy today. So for a book on that topic, I would recommend one called Gay Berlin by a guy named Robert Beachy. It's really well written on the experiences of queer folks after the Holocaust in East Germany. I would recommend one by a historian named Samuel Huneke. It's called States of Liberation. And he gives a really great detailed analysis of the case of gays and lesbians in East Germany. And to give just a very brief kind of summary of that, of those experiences, what East Germany, even though they kind of inherited the Nazi version of paragraph 175, within a matter of months, they strike it from the books and they go back to the original 1871 version, which was, I mean, it was still discriminatory, but it clearly was not as dangerous as the Nazi version of the law. And so the number of paragraph 175 convictions in East Germany is just negligible in comparison to that in West Germany. But one of the things that my colleague Sam Huneke mentions in his book is that East Germany, again, they weren't pro-gay rights by any means, but they had a certain level of tolerance for the queer community as a way of observing them, of surveilling them, having them under surveillance. That if they allowed gays to meet and organize and form clubs, it was easier for the state to keep an eye on them. So there was kind of always this tension between freedom, visibility, and state control in East Germany. Now let's go here, and then we'll go to the back, okay? So we don't know, unfortunately, at least not yet. We know that, so Ravensbrück was the Nazis' concentration camp for women. And so, you know, that's where the lesbians would have been sent, at least mostly. And there are wonderful scholars, Anna Haikova and Laurie Marhofer, Jen Evans, who are working on trying to compile a general estimate, at least, of how many lesbians were sent to the camps and how many died there. So unfortunately, we just don't have those statistics yet, but I am very confident that we will have some of those numbers in the next few years. Oh, here, yes. Oh, hi, Rachel. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, yeah. Hmm. Mm. Yeah. No, so the question was about first queer Jews, but also queer Roma or queer people with disabilities. So how are we as scholars and historians seeking to, number one, understand research, but also write and tell these intersectional histories of the Holocaust? And I think it's a really important question that is, I am very encouraged to see that folks like Anna Hajkova are moving in that direction. I even went into this project thinking, okay, LGBTQ, that's going to be really easy to identify and tell the history of, right? But of course, once you get into the history, you start finding examples of, gay Jewish men, and you're wondering, were they persecuted because they were gay or Jewish? And then you really realize that those questions kind of dissolve, right? And they don't lead to really enlightening us on the experiences, because that man was not just Jewish or just gay. He was both. And so the answer is always both and. So there is still a lot of research left to be done. If a person was queer and Jewish, at least according to the Nazis' views, being Jewish was the ultimate sin, so to speak, was the ultimate crime. And so they would have been punished as such under, as a Jew, and kind of all of their other so-called deviations would have just kind of fallen under that category. So most queer Jews, for example, would have still been marked with a yellow triangle or a yellow Star of David in the concentration camps or the killing centers. I think one of the things that I've also touched on in the first chapter of the book is that intersectionality helps us understand those who are victimized and targeted. We also have to kind of turn the lens to understand intersectional perpetrators, because just as queer people today have a variety of political affiliations, there were queer people in 1930s Germany that would have found Nazism and anti-Semitism, racism to be appealing. And they thought that their devotion to the cause would somehow protect them from being persecuted as a queer person. And then I think in the early years, that was more true. But as the Nazis became more radical and gained more power, they became really more strict on enforcing their ideas of gender and sexuality, even within their ranks. And so by the mid-1930s, regularly purged LGBTQ people from their ranks. So the short long answer is that there is still a lot of work to be done on trying to tell these intersectional stories, and I'm really excited about the future of the scholarship in the area. So first I want to go to the back and then we'll come here. Okay, thank you. Hmm. Yeah, so the question for those online is about how have I experienced or witnessed support or not from Jewish organizations and LGBTQ organizations in confronting various forms of hatred today, I think is the heart of the question. And of course, I can't speak for all queer organizations and all Jewish organizations, but in my personal experience, I have found nothing but unbridled support for each other between these different communities. And I think that one of the things to keep kind of front and center is that we can't also think about these as separate communities, right? Because there are many queer Jewish, people. And so even, at that intersection, I've found some of my most ardent supporters, who want to, share this history, but also find out, how can I support my non-Jewish queer allies? Again, also the same way of how can we support the Jewish community as the queer community? So I know that there are a lot of problems. There's a lot of still work to do in building intersectional coalitions amongst different marginalized groups. And I'm not being at least not willfully ignorant of those problems, but I also find it inspiring and hopeful to see the types of work together that I have in the past. Thank you. Oh, speaking of intersectionality, yeah. Wow. Mm-hmm. Sure. Wow. Mhm. Yeah, well, thank you so much. The question, to just repeat it for online, is this gentleman, this guest here, was at in Washington D.C. at the National March in Washington for I forgot the official name, but the National March for LGBTQ Rights, which was also the same weekend that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opened on the National Mall. And so he went and saw that there was some kind of small, but there was some information on gays and lesbians, Roma, other victims as well. And so the question was, did they ever do more? What does it look like there now? What came of it? I will just say, one of my most exciting interviews that I did for this book was with someone who came from California for the same exact march and was there, I'm guessing, with you. It was one of the very first people inside the museum when it opened on that day. His name was Corbin. And he told me this story of, he went through the exhibit. He did see what you were talking about, the panel on gays and lesbians. But at the end, the exhibit kind of empties you into what they call the Hall of Remembrance, which is kind of an open area where you can light a candle, and it's more of kind of a memorial chamber. And he said, he said, well, we were a bunch of gays and lesbians, so I'm guessing someone had some colored pencils on them. Or maybe they had, had them from the march from the day before making signs, but on the comment cards, people had started drawing pink triangles and yellow stars. And as a way of memorializing the gay victims, people just started silently throwing these cards into the middle of the Hall of Remembrance. And so he said, I just remember seeing this stack of pink triangles and yellow cards there. And I just can't imagine what that must have looked like or been like. So you're right, the museum did receive some, well, number one, I will say, hindsight is 2020, right? But going back and doing the research, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was the very first federal institution, a memorial or a museum anywhere in the world to even acknowledge that gay people were victimized by the Nazi regime. So on that stance, on that point, it was unique in the world. They took the criticism that there was not enough or a lot of information on the Nazis' gay victims. And instead of saying, well, you know what, there's just no scholarship on it. How can we how can we be held to blame for that? They actually did a fundraising campaign, and from what I understand, raised over $1 million to fund new research into the topic. They supported researchers from across North America and the United States, so North America and Europe, to go deeper and produce more information. There was a conference, but one of the things that came out of that was a permanent traveling exhibit on the topic. So they said, okay, well, we can't like redesign our entire permanent exhibit here in the building, but what we can make sure is that this topic gets its own exhibit that travels all across the country. And at least when I spoke with the curator, this must have been probably 5 or 6 years ago, it was the only traveling exhibit that had never come like back to be stored. It had been requested and traveling ever since it was released in 2002. And so I do commend them on doing raising the funds and then supporting your research on the topic when really no one else was at the time. In the back. We have another 1993 March attendee. Mm-hmm. 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 So I guess, so what I will say, so the question has multiple components, but was that, that there was a lot of debate, even anger at using the pink triangle for various reasons. And number one being that the American government was not a whole lot better after the Holocaust and treating the LGBTQ community. And then a question tacked on at the end was that she was surprised to see that that there wasn't a lot of scholarship on the topic, even though in the 80s they at least knew about the history behind the pink triangle. So I guess I'll add the caveat that in the 70s and into the 80s, there was at least basic knowledge required for this symbol to be successful as an activist symbol, because at least people had to know that it referred to the Holocaust and the sheer fact that gay people were also targeted in the Holocaust. So there was kind of like the Wikipedia one-liner level of knowledge that was available, that the pink triangle existed. It originated in the 1930s and it marked gay prisoners in the concentration camps. When I say that there was no scholarship on it available, I mean that everything that was factually known about it really could probably fill up a page or two, right? There wasn't at the same level of scholars who were diving into other aspects of the Holocaust that could fill up entire books, where they were, going into the archives and finding out, well, why did the Nazis persecute gay people? Were there differences between experiences of gay men and lesbians or transgender people? How did the ordinary Germans react to the homophobic policies? So having that level of kind of more traditional professional historical scholarship wasn't there. So that's what I mean when I say like no scholarship. But clearly there had to be enough of knowledge about it for it even to be effective. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And remember, the book is a hug, so. Mhm. Mm. Thank you so much for that question. So the question is kind of about my experience or way into the research, but then also the relationships that I've developed through the research that help support the project. As a historian in graduate school, we're taught like we have to be taken seriously as a social scientist, and that means we have to be objective, whatever that means, right? And you have to remove yourself from your topic. I was actually told by a professor one time that I should be careful in choosing this topic because people might make assumptions about me, and that we are often, and I was like, y'all, I am from Georgia, I'm so naive. I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, well, I'm a woman and I study women's history. So if you go out presenting on this gay history, people might wonder. And I was like, wonder, they don't have to wonder, honey, I'll tell them. Like, I don't know what you're talking, like, I don't know what the issue is. Jokes aside, I was, again, told in graduate school that writing history, you have to be removed and objective. And I tried for so long, some of the original drafts of this book, to like hold the topic at arm's length and write about it in an objective, scholarly way. And I myself didn't even like what I had written. I would write it back and say, this is not capturing what I really want to say and tell people. And then it occurred to me that it was absolutely impossible for me to separate this history that I was researching with my own process of coming out and finding myself. And instead of trying to hide that or separate it, to in fact lean into it and embrace it for what it is, because that is what history is for all of us, right? Especially those who aren't professional historians. It is a way for us to explore the past, to find out who we are. I happen just to do it right in a book. So at the end of the day, I feel that not only are the words and the flow better, but the scholarship is actually better for me leaning into that and just taking ownership of the fact that I am writing this from a certain position as a queer person, writing about people like me in time. I loved your question about relationships, because this book, hands down, would not have been possible without compassionate, meaningful relationships with people spread out all over the world. As I mentioned, this information for this book was not in the state archives or the federal archives. I spent, so much time identifying small LGBTQ grassroots, essentially community centers that doubled as archives, that were run by volunteers, who, nothing was digitized. They didn't have finding aids. I would have to email them and be like, I'm coming in a few months. This is my topic. You got anything? And they would be like, look, I really don't know. Like, there's boxes and boxes. There's some Ziplocs. I don't know. You can go through it. Two quick stories. One time I found this archive online, got the address. This was back in MapQuest days, if anyone remembers that. So like I printed out this MapQuest directions and I go and I end up in an apartment complex. I'm like, oh man, I definitely printed out the wrong thing. I'm in Germany, like there's definitely no smartphones. So I just decided I press the doorbell of the address that I've gotten. And I go up to this man's apartment. And it turns out that this archive was put together solely by one individual man. He had been collecting his entire life, and it was the most organized, well-preserved archive that I've ever been to. But I spent months just sitting at his kitchen table. Like, he would make a pot of coffee and I would say, okay, Reiner, I'm looking for something that, and he would be like, give me a minute, I'll find it, And he would come back, and then not only would I be able to see these documents from some from the 30s, but mostly from the gay rights movement. And I would be able to say, Reiner, I don't know what this says here. And he would just be able to tell me these incredible stories, right? Another example is in Cologne. It's an organization called the Schwules Geschichte Cologne. And they would, again, they were a volunteer-led organization. So the guy, the archivist, I think he was like a banker or something. He had a 9-to-5, and he would say, well, I can't come let you in the archive until I get off of work. So, during the day I would do my work. I would meet him at the train station coming from his job, and like we would both bring our sandwiches, and he would let me into the archive and stay with me throughout the night as long as I needed to collect as much information as I could. And those are just the types of stories that I could list, dozens more, that show that it is the queer community ourselves who are dedicated to finding and preserving this history and then sharing it with each other. And I'll get a little emotional, but one of my most proud moments was being able to send a copy of the book back to these archives and be like, look what came out of you taking your sandwich and meeting me there those nights. Like, I was able to write this book because of that. And it's just an incredible feeling of solidarity amongst the archivists, the activists, and the authors. Now let's go here and then here. So the question is, after studying the Holocaust, and particularly this community, how worried am I about the United States today? In the Holocaust scholars field, I think it's pretty divided. There are a lot of folks who would say, no, you can't make comparisons to what we're going through today, and it's just hyperbole, and you're just crying wolf. And to a certain extent, I agree with that. I mean, every chapter of history is unique, and nothing is going to be exactly like Germany in the 1930s. But I think that when we have such a hard wall up against against all comparisons, we miss the warning signs. Because there were warning signs in the 1930s that, of course, in the time, you don't see those warning signs. We have the advantage of hindsight to see that was a warning sign. So when we see very similar things happening today, I think that we ignore them at our own peril. I think that when we, after the Holocaust, the world promised never again, right? Never again genocide. Clearly, we've fallen short of that promise again and again and again. I think that never again has to not be only related to mass murder and genocide and gas chambers. Because if our measuring stick for when something is bad is gas chambers in Auschwitz, it's not going to measure up, right? And so we can look and say, hey, things are pretty bad outside, but there aren't gas chambers, and we let ourselves off the hook, right? We take responsibility away from ourselves. So never again has to mean never again the dehumanizing language, never again the targeted policies that turn into laws, right? That dictate how people live their lives. To now more directly answer your question, I think that we should be very upset and worried about what's happening, because the rhetoric that was leveled against the LGBTQ community in Nazi Germany was that they are trying to seduce your children into the homosexual lifestyle, right? That they are dangerous, that they are not only immoral, but they're degrading our culture. But again and again, they talked about how they're coming after your children, right? Which is just the same argument of grooming today. And you know what, looking back in history, what you see is that those types of arguments were planned in a way to unite different factions of the conservative right wing that might disagree on like economics or foreign policy, but they could all agree on queer folks are bad and they're trying to come for our children. It's happening again today. And so I think that I'm not going to say 5 years from now it's going to look exactly like the Holocaust, but we do see where it could lead, and that should be frightening enough. All right, so here, and then I know I want to take a time check too. Yeah, okay, so let's take this question and then maybe we'll start wrapping up. Mm.
You know, and I'm very familiar with that thing within the last couple of decades of their history, and I think that within like non-Jewish LGBTQ communities, there's always been that like you have to know your history, right? The old guard who worked before you and you should know about it, perspective, sort of fears of saying it. That is very much mirrored in the Jewish community.
Oh, wow.
I think because like when we were talking about having studied the Holocaust for years but never seen this, my first father said that he's not good.
Yeah.
Because it's Jewish fear. I think I knew this similar.
Wow.
And I'm trying to actually like formulate the question. If you could encourage the new generation, whether they be queer or Jewish or both or neither, to take, I don't know, one lesson from this or to learn about one piece of history, what would you want that to be?
Wow. So the question is, if I could have, especially the younger generation, take one piece of advice, a lesson, or piece of history away from this project, what would it be? It's one that I have already said, but I think it bears repeating. You know, this symbol, the pink triangle, was worn by it was forced upon a particular group, right? Queer men, queer non-Jewish men in the concentration camps. Through activism and community building, it was expanded and it came to mean a lot more than that. I think that the one lesson I would hope that folks would take away is that this triangle came out of or on the heels of a supposedly vibrant, educated democracy. And that the Nazis did not have to do this on their own, right? Their success, if you want to frame it that way, in persecuting the LGBTQ community was only made possible by the collaboration and complicity of ordinary people. So I think that imbues all of us with a special responsibility to understand that individual human rights aren't just inherently given, that they have to be fought for and defended, whether it is, your own individual kind of identity or that of others, because at any minute can be taken away. And so I think, to me, the pink triangle's biggest lesson is vigilance, right? And staying aware and keeping a watchful eye over the rights that we have and still need to win. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. And thanks. And thanks to all of you who signed on and are watching virtually. I really appreciate you logging on. I know that we will have some time afterwards. If you want to pick up a copy of the book, I'm happy to sign it. We can continue any of our conversations there in the lobby. So again, thanks to all of you, and thanks to all the co-sponsors for putting this together.